Breaking down the 2025 wide receiver class. That's what we're going to talk about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we're going to talk wide receivers today. We talked about the running backs on the last episode. Very in depth. You give me and all the listeners a great look at some really intriguing names. You've written a ton of great stuff in the RotoViz rookie guide. We're going to talk a little bit about the receivers today from this rookie class as well. As always, make sure you go get the rookie guide. You're not going to get all of the information you may want or need just from this show here, but we're not going to hold anything back. It's just hard to go through it all. It's a lot easier when you have all the data sitting in front of you and you can write it all up and all that stuff. But we're going to talk about the wide receivers, and this class is not as exciting as the running back class. It's not as exciting as essentially any of the recent wide receiver classes, which have all been very strong. We know wide receiver is a position that the NFL cares a lot about at this point. They care a lot about it from free agent contracts. They care a lot about it from the way that they've been drafting it over the last several drafts. Some of these guys are going to get some draft capital because teams want to address this position. It's an important position in the modern NFL. And yet the profiles are just not necessarily great. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions about them. There's a couple interesting ones at the top, certainly. But I'm starting to do a little of my kind of targets per out run research, which I was telling you before the show. I always use that as like a foundational stat, and I add a lot of context. It's a lot easier for me to add that context at the NFL level when I'm doing stealing signals and I'm watching all the games and I'm very tied into the NFL. I don't really have that context around the targets per out run stuff for a lot of the college players. So for me, it's I'm waiting to talk to you and to hear from people that are a lot smarter than me to try to fill in some of the blanks around some of these profiles. I'm gonna have a bunch of questions for you today. But just looking at the raw numbers for things like the targets per out run or the per route data and that stuff, I was just telling you before the show, I can't even get that much of an opinion on some of these players. They're okay profile. There's at least one early player that you can have a pretty strong negative opinion on if you want to. And there's a couple that are really intriguing in a positive perspective, or at least interesting to think about. But a lot of the players, it's like, they're okay. I guess there's parts of this where if they were good, it wouldn't be that shocking to me, I guess, but they're not bets that I really would want to make. They're not even something I can talk myself into necessarily, but it's also something I won't necessarily talk myself out of. I'm really interested in what the league thinks and what draft capital winds up being on really in day two in that second tier from wide receiver 6 to wide receiver 20 or something in this group. But we've been talking about some names before the show. We're going to talk about a bunch on the show. How are you doing?
Good. It was so much fun to talk running backs with you last week. I do have the big Dynasty article up on the site, Ben. I put our conversation about our team in there so people can also get kind of the deeper dive that you and I did on the show. We have since made some adjustments to that team.
That's right.
We received an offer of CJ Stroud, which, especially with the bad news coming out about Derek Carr, again, many listeners are like, there's nothing other than bad news about Derek Carr. You shouldn't have him on your team. It made QB.
I do love that every time you bring up Derek Carr, you reference that you're the only one who likes Derek Carr.
You assume that Derek Carr has some family and friends who are on board. The numbers are sometimes on board. Rashid Shaheed, you would think, would probably be on board. They had some nice connections early in the season last year. But then we received the offer of Stroud for Kyren Williams, Juwan Jennings. An interesting offer because you could certainly see how Williams and Jennings both score a lot next season. I was pretty high on Williams last year. He mostly came through on that. One of the things that I look at with these running backs where you have someone like Blake Corum behind him, I do have concerns that, similar to what we saw with Zach Charbonnet, similar to what we saw with Tank Bigsby, I think that running back in the Bigsby, Charbonnet, Corum type of talent level, draft level is a bigger threat in the second year than they were potentially in the first. we'll see how that all pans out. We're actually very high on Jennings for redraft, but I guess my thought would be that these are the types of players who maybe don't have the type of moat around either playing time and or just the talent. So the talent is maybe not creating the same type of moat that other players at the same scoring level for, even thinking ahead to 2025 might have over 2, 3, certainly 5 years. Don't do for us what Stroud might do over the next decade. This perhaps could be a small loss type of move, but hopefully for us, it could be a big win.
Yeah. I mean, he's a player, Stroud. We talked about, I think, a little bit when we were breaking down our Dynasty team, when we got a different offer to give up the 101 or move back from the 101. And I think I mentioned it on the show, but my initial response to you, even on that, was like, man, maybe we need to take this because we're so weak at quarterback. And Stroud being such a young, I think he's still 23 when I was looking at their ages of all the players in this particular deal. Being so young and having still had that really great rookie season, I think there's enough there that I feel really good about the floor and those things. And then, I mean, just a year ago, we were talking about him as like the number 1 overall player going into his second season after that rookie year. He had a really disappointing second season with the lack of mobility. We talked through it on the show. You made some great points. With the lack of mobility and all of those things, it's hard to even see a future now where he's a top 5 player because he already didn't have that right profile. He needed to be really exceptional as a passer to get there. It looked like in that rookie season he would be that, and that second season was that disappointing for his overall range of outcomes. I mean, it took away this, he's a truly transcendent, one of the greatest passing quarterbacks of all time sort of outcome, probably, because it just wasn't a very good year. There was a lot that he really struggled with. And yet when you step back from that and you reassess, you say, okay, not quite as high of a ceiling anymore. These massive home run outcomes aren't there anymore. And yet I don't think there's a real low floor. He's done enough through 2 years at a young age. There's a lot of stuff I can make a lot of excuses for last year with the offensive line and different things, all the wide receiver injuries, a lot of different things. Maybe he's trying to force things. Just the fact that players tend to have sophomore slumps sometimes, just that it's difficult to back up when you're a young professional, a great rookie season with the same maybe type of preparation in the offseason and all of those things, whatever you want to say. I don't know. I don't want to make too much speculation, but I think when I look at CJ Stroud going forward, I can make excuses for the second season. And I've seen enough in the first season and the other stuff he did in the second season that like he's going to be good. He's still a very good quarterback, a good NFL player, and he's still young. Like you think about Dynasty, you think about future trade value and super flex. He's going to have big seasons where he stacks TD rates with, he still has Nico Collins there and presumably Tank Dell maybe down the line, right? Getting back from these early career injuries that have been so disheartening. They brought in Christian Kirk. Like he's got talent. He's got the ability to have those type of spike pocket passer seasons that we know like past TD rate can be so huge on. Throws 35, 40 touchdowns one year. We might be able to retrade him at some point. He's still in his mid-20s. This could be 3 years down the line, but he's still in his mid-20s. And he's looking like a guy who's, finishes as a top 3 quarterback at, in one season, and then he's retradable potentially. So anyway, as far as like his value and his dynasty, profile, I feel pretty good about acquiring him right now. And I was saying to you, for both Kyron and Juwan Jennings, I mean, like you said, they seem like guys that are going to score a lot of points in 2025, but they're also both older than you probably want them to be. Kyron, I believe, is 25 already, or going to be 25 before the start of next season. And as good as I think he is, his situation is, pretty situational. He's not this elite athlete, and there's this great, McVay offense thing he has going right now. But I don't know that we've seen some backs be really good into their late 20s in recent years. I don't know that Kyron Williams is the profile that I think will be good at age 28, 29 when I start to think 3-4 years down the road. So good in the short term, but maybe not great 2026, 2027 and beyond as far as how his career develops when he's getting into his later 20s, and maybe not the workhorse for the Rams anymore, basically, which could start as soon as 2025, right? Like we don't know when that could happen for him. And we talked about this on the show, but we're deep at running back, and we still have the 101. We're probably going to be taking Ashton Jeanty, and we have multiple other picks that may also be running backs. We were kind of worried about being too deep at running back in our last conversation. So moving a guy like Kyren for some quarterback help when we have Tua and Derek Carr, which is like reliability level very low there, definitely the right type of a like transfer of where the strength of our roster is. And then Juwan Jennings, again, another guy, situation looks great for 2025. I'm kind of a believer, but he's like 28 as well. So you're already talking about, now I think he'll be good for a couple of years probably. I think the breakout in 2024 was pretty real, and I think he'll be pretty good now for a couple of years. But you're talking about not really having a 5-year plan for a player like that. It's not like he's 25 or 26. Like he's going to be in his 30s here by like 2027 or whatever it is. And so another guy where I think it sets up nicely in the short term. And it may not, it's not a guarantee to continue to be good in 2025 after the breakout 2024. That could just be his career year, as one flash in the pan year. We've seen that from a lot of late breakouts over their careers as well. I would expect him to back it up a little bit. I wouldn't expect the longevity to be there necessarily. So I do think that my favorite part of the trade was just in Dynasty, trying to think through the way that guys are going to hold value and trying to think through that we probably moved 2 guys that I don't expect to hold value particularly well 2 to 3 years down the road. It's harder to think about in Dynasty. You're never really certain, but we probably moved 2 guys that I don't feel great about 2 to 3 years down the road necessarily holding. And we got one that I kind of feel like he's near his floor 2 to 3 years down the road, that there's not a lot of ways that we could think worse about CJ Stroud 2 to 3 years from now. And there's all this potential asymmetrical upside if he does rebound and it does go down as a sophomore slump for him. So beyond just shuffling the balance of our team and also just getting some depth, any 2-for-1 where you can consolidate some depth is nice when you have a lot of picks right before a rookie draft like we do. I really like the trade from a future value perspective.
Yeah, you think about trading 2-for-1 and what that could do to your lineup this year, and yet CJ Stroud will probably have more total playable fantasy seasons going forward than Williams and Jennings combined, sort of as you described there. The other thing is that making that trade didn't actually impact our starting lineup in a meaningful way because of the depth we have. And also, as you mentioned, it sort of clears the runway for those 3 first-round picks, and then we have a lot of second and third-round picks as well. Hopefully this will be a win-win. Talk a lot about that on the various shows, that if you get that reputation for working with your trade partners and giving them things that help them, it becomes easier to keep these types of trades going. I could see this helping both teams in 2025, and that's what you're looking for. Then we have the 101. Probably that pick will not be a receiver, as we've mentioned, and yet there's at least one guy who is challenging for an early pick in this class.
Yeah, and probably 2, right? But I think you're talking about Tet McMillan, who I still haven't figured out how to say his full first name, so I don't want to butcher it. Has a really good profile. It's expected. Well, I mean, I'm hearing that maybe he'll slide a little bit. Expected to go, I think, in the first half of the first round, but maybe there's a possibility that he slides to the back half of the first round. I'm not entirely sure. The other guy that I said there's maybe 2 is just Travis Hunter, which is a whole enigma wrapped in what's the phrase? Wrapped in a riddle, wrapped in a whatever. I mean, we don't know what we don't know about him, but I've said my piece on him. I think it's been silly that people have thought that he wouldn't play both ways, and then he came out the week before the draft, and did exactly what I expected him to do all along, which is say that his quote was pretty direct. He would quit football if he couldn't play both ways, which look, he has the leverage right now. And this is what, Eli Manning did right before his draft 20 years ago. This is what John Elway did right before his draft 20 years prior to that. They said, I'm not going to play on these particular teams. And then they didn't play on those teams because you put the teams in a situation where you don't really have a choice. And if you've said it beforehand, their fans, if you wind up drafting that player and then they don't play for you, the fans are going to be like, you knew it beforehand. It was clear. It's been, this was in the media beforehand. You're the idiot for still drafting him. So he's played that card now, and the teams that are going to go get him now have to be very excited to play him both ways, is the way that I would anticipate the team talking about it. And the team that is overwhelmingly likely to take him, it seems, is the Browns at number 2, and they have already discussed that. They've talked about seeing him as a wide receiver first as well, but in particular, they've talked about him playing both ways. And he said all the teams he's talked to have talked about him playing both ways. It just seems to be like draft analysts and fantasy analysts that can't wrap their head around the fact that this is a unique player that already did a unique thing in college last year and won the Heisman doing this, played 700 plus snaps on both sides of the ball last year. People are like, how much is he really going to play? He played 700 plus snaps on both sides of the ball last year. Anyway, I said I already did the Travis Hunter thing, but I'm doing it again. He's another one that is an interesting profile, but you're talking Ted McMillan, right? And he has a really strong profile, pretty good freshman year, right? But almost 1,400 yards in his second year. Third year, they play fewer games, I believe, and he has 1,316 yards. Another strong season, a little bit better actually per route. 2 really strong. He ran fewer routes. It was actually his fewest routes of his career in 2024, but has been out there a ton, between 450 and 500 routes all 3 years of his career, and been productive basically from day one, and then especially over the last 2 years. I'm seeing a lot of Drake London comps, and I saw a little bit of like concern about his downfield ability. I told you from watching him, to me, I guess I don't necessarily get that comp, but I was reading our buddy Pat Corain's write up on him, and he was talking about why the profile is similar to London's, kind of the short and intermediate stuff, some of that. But when I watch him, I see like a lankier and a little bit longer receiver than I think of London. I see more of like young AJ Green, which was a stud, by the way, but maybe AJ Green just a better downfield receiver than what we'll see from Ted McMillan. Is that where I'm missing it? I guess stylistically, not statistically, I don't necessarily see London. I'm curious what your kind of perspective is of what he is and what he looks like to you.
Yeah, I guess I don't understand exactly where that's coming from. It certainly doesn't show up in the sports info solution numbers. And this is a guy who led power conference receivers with almost 1,800 air yards last year. He drew the most targets of 15 or more air yards in 2024, the second most in 2023. He was successful inside and out with 48 and 50 slot targets in the last couple of seasons. He had 27 evaded tackles last year, 13 broken, 14 forced missed tackles. So again, I mean, you're talking about a guy who gets deep extremely well, runs with the ball extremely well. I think the Drake London comp is interesting, and it is.
I've seen that like 6 times. I mean, it seems to be like the only comp that anyone has for the guy.
Well, he's also the closest comp that we have for McMillan in the box score scout. And so, I mentioned that, and yet it's not a particularly close comp in terms of our particular sim score. And one of the things is that I think that you're going to get significantly more dynamism. And when you think about Drake London, some of the slow start to his career from a total volume perspective is just on Arthur Smith. When you look at a lot of the per route stuff, he was very good all along. Certainly you look at the 2024 season, and it justified where he was going ADP wise. It certainly sets him up to be an exciting player again in 2025. Being comped to Drake London should put you as easily the top pure receiver in this draft, should put you as a top 10 pick. And then, I mean, I don't know that you're necessarily going to get more production when you, again, account for context than what Drake London is giving the Falcons. But I do think that he was a better prospect than Drake London. And I don't think that that is particularly close even. Now, one of the things that you're looking at with London is that he had more team competition when he was in college. With McMillan, what you're dealing with is that Arizona was so bad that McMillan had to carry everything. And as a result, obviously his market share numbers are ultra elite, but you have to look at what the other numbers are as well, and not simply be like, oh, well, the numbers look good because he plays for this bad Arizona team. The numbers look good despite that. he's able to carry them even though everyone knows what's coming. And he did it stylistically in a way that is incredibly fun to watch and was, again, sort of utterly dominant.
I was looking at Drake London's profile and Googled him, and on the front page, there's multiple references of Ted McMillan right on the front page. That's all anyone's talking about as it relates to Drake London right now as well. London, I was looking at his size, 6'4", 215, because I do think of him as like a little shorter and a little stockier when I'm talking about watching these guys. McMillan, 6'5", 212. Doesn't sound that different, but McMillan's an inch taller and yet 3 pounds lighter, and that actually is a somewhat meaningful difference in terms of like what you think of as like body mass or whatever. But that, I mean, I didn't realize London was 6'4", to be honest with you. I guess I probably knew that, but just sort of the way, maybe I'm just thinking of London differently than a lot of these comps, but the way I envision Drake London, or would use him as a comp, or would think about him, a little bit different than what I think of as McMillan brings, at least physically, which is not the point. You're talking about the profile as well, the massive number of air yards. You said he had almost 1,800. He had almost 1,700 the year prior. He had 1,300 as a true freshman. I mean, he's had massive numbers of air yards over all 3 years. The ADOT has been solidly above average all 3 years. Average is typically around 11. He was 16.2 as a true freshman, 12.9, 13.7, and the numbers I have here. But earning a lot of volume at those ADOTs, really strong. I had the weighted targets per out run number I like to look at. Really strong weighted targets per out run, especially the last 2 years. 3-year early declare, all the things you're just talking about. Seems pretty straightforward. Yeah, where do you think he might slide? I was hearing that maybe he might slide a little bit, but I guess I don't understand why that would happen either in this class. I feel like there would be a premium on the one receiver that seems like a pretty legit, not can't miss. I don't know that anybody's ever a can't miss, but he seems like the best profile by a lot, right?
Well, what's your sense of why he might fall? I mean, we've noted that if you're being comped to Drake London, that probably shouldn't be a negative. One of the things that I've talked a lot about, and certainly I don't want to act like it was definitive that Marvin Harrison was going to disappoint last year, or that he couldn't come out and be very good this coming season, right? But when I was looking at Marvin Harrison, the concern that I had was that almost all of it was about getting open. And that's a huge skill for a receiver. But the ball in his hands dynamic was not particularly strong, especially for someone who is being viewed as that level of prospect. McMillan doesn't have that issue. And so I think that in the current NFL, big receivers are potentially running into concerns about, can you get open? And then how dynamic are you going to be? We know that some of the little guys have really thrived recently. Is that the sense that you're getting? Because again, it just doesn't really feel like this is the type of class that he could possibly fall in. And yet that is the scuttlebutt.
Yeah, I was reading, I mentioned Pat Crane's write-up. I was reading his write-up this morning, which he wrote up the first few wide receivers, and actually got that sent out this morning as we're recording on Wednesday. And so I had looked through it this morning, and in his notes, he had just written, currently McMillan looks unlikely to be drafted in the top 10, which I assume is just based on different mocks and things. But then he wrote, it makes Dallas at 12 look like a likely landing spot, and that looks ideal. But then he mentioned, if the Cowboys pass, it's possible we're looking at a fall into the 20s. In part, it seems because of the sort of the team needs in the teens and stuff. But I guess I would think somebody would probably trade up. I don't know that. I'm not trying to put that on. And the reason I'm sharing what Pat specifically wrote is I don't think even he would stand by that as like a really strong point that he was trying to make, that the McMillan's going to fall to the 20s or anything.
No, I mean,
I think he was just saying it's a possibility,
right? And you look at the different teams. I think that your point though about trade up, because one of the things that has been a just constant refrain for us is that you need to build super teams. And yet, I mean, would it be surprising when you think about the haves and the have-nots, the really well-run organizations versus those that are not as well-run, to see a team that is already kind of verging on great, a team that already is loaded on offense, see a fall from a player like this and just be like, well, I'm going to go up and get that guy, right? You don't necessarily have to wait for him to fall to you.
Right. That would be my expectation. I'm looking at the NFL mock draft database. They have him most commonly mocked to the Cowboys at 12. On their consensus big board, they have him as the 11th overall player. So, I mean, that's, a consensus of all the big boards that are out there. I don't think, even when you just look at it from that perspective and not considering the positional value, that his profile is looked at negatively. I know there's a lot of like edges in the first round and a lot of different types of players that, could land, that could push down some of our, fun fantasy positions a little bit this year. The Seahawks picked there between 10 and 20, and everyone is expecting them to take an interior offensive lineman, but maybe they just say, screw it, we want Ted McMillan. They clearly don't think offensive line is an actual position on the football field. So that's not something that is locked in stone. It's just that most people think that they probably should draft a lineman at some point, but we'll see if that happens. Anyway, McMillan looks like a really intriguing prospect. I was talking about Hunter a little bit. The big question on Hunter, Sean, seems to be how many routes at receiver he will run. I do think he's gonna play at receiver. I think we agree on that, and that he was always going to be pretty adamant about getting the opportunity to do that for reasons that I've talked about that relate to his second contract and those types of things. These guys want to be his legacy long term. This guy wants to be a Hall of Famer someday. He wants to make huge contracts down the road. He understands all of that kind of stuff. That's a big reason. Again, he went and played for Dion in college and won the Heisman there. And by all accounts, as a guy who has a massive work ethic and all of that, there's people that consistently point out he can't be in two meeting rooms at once. We understand that. There's
but
also not a limit.
People tell me that corner is a manageable position from the perspective of some of those types of things. I don't have the insight into it, but he's going to do it. That's
interesting. Yeah, so, he's going to do it. Troy Brown did it for the Patriots. And as you say that, I remember when Bill Belichick put Troy Brown at cornerback mid-season that one year because they had so many cornerback issues. The wide receiver Troy Brown played cornerback. And Belichick obviously was like, well, you can manage it on the defensive side, even though you haven't been practicing it all year. That's just literally have not heard that referenced. I'm sure it's been referenced, but I hadn't thought about it once. It just popped into my head when you say the manageable thing. It's actually, there's a little bit of a precedent there. John Ross at the University of Washington did it that one year when the University of Washington started to have, they kicked Marcus Peters off the team. They started to have a bunch of quarterback issues, and head coach Peterson decided that he was going to have John Ross jump over to cornerback like mid-season as well. So, I mean, whatever. My argument would be that in college, there's some limit on how much time they can practice and all that stuff. There's no limit in the pros. We've seen some of these teams, like remember the famous Kyler Murray stuff, like they try to put a clause in his contract about playing video games. By all accounts, Travis Hunter has talked about this himself. I think he has a fiance and a steady girlfriend, but football is his life. He talks about this a ton. He's made a big deal. He doesn't drink. This seems like the kind of guy, and he's desperate to do this. He's talked about it so much. The quote about him quitting football didn't seem to me to be like anything other than like, that's how much I want to accomplish this goal, like that. Because the question was framed, it seemed, I couldn't find the specific question the way that it was written up. The quote was given to CBS Sports. Based on his answer, it seemed like the question was framed was like, what would it mean if you had to choose one? Because his quote was something like, it would mean quitting football, right? It wasn't like I'm going out of my way to say I'm going to quit if they don't let me do this. It was like him saying, that's what football is to me. It's what it's always been. I've played both sides of the ball, etc. Both him and Shadur Sanders, who obviously they played together in college, have made comments about how at the college level they play a lot faster. The average time to snap is quite a bit lower. And so they talked about like he actually had to have great stamina to be able to deal with the down to down tempo in college relative to the NFL, where they both commented the NFL, they actually play a little slower. And I think it's a fair point. Anyway, the big question is how many routes can he run at the NFL level? I mentioned earlier in the show, he played over 700 snaps on both sides of the ball in college last year, and not even in a full NFL season. At the NFL level, there's usually a few players that run over 600 routes. There's usually like maybe 5. There's usually about 15 or so more who run between 500 and 600. Now, injuries and other things impact this. That's based on PFS numbers, by the way. Your numbers at SIS, we've always talked about this. The routes are a little bit lower. There's usually not a massive number of players that run over 500 routes, is my point. I've seen people talk about like where his route participation falls being a really big key. I guess I don't see it that much. I'm going to mention our buddy Pat Crane for the third time already this show, but a couple years ago, he did some research that showed that when rookies hit, they tend to hit on the efficiency side more than the route volume side. That was a big part of the reason last year when I remember I was talking about Trey McBride a bunch. I was referencing a lot as it related to Marvin Harrison that rookies don't come in typically and just dominate in a massive way, that even two of the clearest rookie hits in recent years, Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, who came right in and played a lot early in the first month of their seasons and then were starters the whole season and were productive, they both went on to add at least 2 targets per game in their sophomore season as they developed like a second breakout. It's really tough, I think, for rookies in general to see massive amounts of volume. Their teams don't necessarily rely on them. And yet we know rookie wide receivers matter for fantasy. They do hit, because when they do hit, they tend to hit on the efficiency side. They tend to hit yards per target, massive TD rates, spiking the yards per route run. If Travis Hunter is not running a massive number of routes, I expect his targets per route run to be inflated by manufactured plays his direction. First of all, I'll just flat out say that. And I also believe he has the profile to go out and have enough big plays. And it really takes like 3 to 5 explosive plays, and you push your yards per target up into that level. You over the course of a season, long touchdowns, right? If you have 3 to 5, it's basically hard to not have an elite yards per route run if you had 3 to 5 long touchdowns in a season. I'm not saying that's definitely going to happen for Travis Hunter. I am saying it would be surprising to me if the team he was on wasn't trying to use him in situations to create those types of those opportunities. And I am saying I think that's very clearly within his range of outcomes, even if he doesn't run 500 routes as a rookie, even if he's at, let's say 400. And people will say that's too low of a route participation, whatever you want to call that, 70% routes or 75% routes or something like that, maybe even a little less. I don't know. I think he could still be a fantasy impact player in that route range, because I think those would be really high impact routes. I think the team would be trying to, I think from a targets per route perspective, you'd see a high, an inflation on those 400 routes. And I think from an efficiency perspective, his profile is good enough for us to feel that he could have the spike potential. That would be in the range, right? The efficiency stuff's harder to pin down, but we're often betting on these types of things. Anyway, that's my argument for how Travis Hunter could actually score in fantasy. The way that other rookie, and my main point is the other rookies often don't run 600 routes either, right? So I don't think the gap would actually be that much different than many of the other recent rookies if he's held back a little bit. Maybe it would ultimately be an influence on his true single season peak in like year 3 or year 4, or how his wide receiver role can develop if he's never a 90% route participation guy. My main point is I don't know that his wide receiver routes will be that much different than most rookie receivers. Anyway, what can you tell us about his actual profile as a wide receiver and how much confidence we should have that he's an elite player at the next level?
Yeah, so you mentioned all that stuff. It reminded me a lot of the things that Blair has written about, both the necessity for efficiency, and then the other thing you sort of alluded to, sometimes people get a sense that if the player was very good as a rookie, you're not going to get that second year leap. And because, it's all been squeezed out, and Blair's research again shows that is definitely not the case. You want to be in on those guys if there's any sort of ADP gap that you're being given. The other thing I was thinking a lot about is how Tyreek Hill has consistently had, and again, his last season was not as strong, but you think about so much of what he did with the Dolphins prior to that, where his yard per route numbers are absolutely off the charts. Some of that is actually because of lower route participation. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a situation where you have full route participation, and it doesn't have to be a situation even necessarily where it's all manufactured targets. Now, I do agree with your note that there will be some, but then the question is, can he do the rest of it as well? It was interesting to kind of follow his trajectory because it really is that last season there with Colorado where you see the big numbers from him. And I think it's probably legitimate for people to still be, mildly concerned about some of the context there, and that his per route and per play numbers don't necessarily jump off the charts. But part of what was happening there in Colorado is they're doing everything possible to try and get Sanders an early draft pick. So a lot of passes, they brought in other transfers. There are 3 other, probably not NFL players, but like practice squad types of guys who are also on that team. And so you've got 3 other like meaningful receivers drawing targets away from him. And we're also now sort of hearing that not only may Sanders not go like 2, 3, 4, Sanders may not go in the first round. And that actually does fit with a lot of the things that you see from him. When you look at it from that context, the things that Hunter did are pretty impressive, right? He runs this huge number of routes, which for the conditioning thing, as you note, is very meaningful, scores the 15 touchdowns. But I again really like this combination of traits where he has 264 yards after contact. Right? This is not like some small corner who doesn't want to mix it up and be a football player. I mean, it's really the opposite here. We get 28 evaded tackles. He's breaking tackles. He's forcing mixed tackles. He's going to get 35 targets of 15 or more air yards. On those targets, he caught 19 of the 23 that SIS has labeled as catchable. 0 of those are drops. So there's a slight difference between if you don't catch a catchable target and like a pure drop. He has over 500 yards on those types of targets, but he also had 99 defensive pass interference yards on top of the actual yards that he gained. This is a rising star who does look like a potential fantasy weapon. He's probably gone too late during pre-NFL draft best ball season. I think he's going to rise. I think he's the other kind of clear-cut star in this group. And then one of the reasons, kind of as we get back to McMillan or kind of round out these, that's very clear tier at the top, one of the reasons I'd be surprised if McMillan falls is that there's a fairly strong argument that there is not another true first-round receiver in this class, even though we do expect other guys to get drafted.
Yeah, it's a really interesting class. I'm glad you brought up Blair's research, which I meant to mention. I kind of just blew past, but that was there's so much fascinating stuff with rookies, right? There's some of the rookies that we don't see develop until later in the rookie season. They don't run a ton of routes early, like AJ Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown. They had these great second halves of their rookie season, a lot less in the first half. And I think there's some stuff that has been shown as far as aggregate, like I was going to mention this as it relates to my note on Pat's research, where you look at the lack of routes and the lack of routes in the rookie hits, that it's more of an efficiency thing. Some of that could be argued, well, it's just because they don't run a lot of routes until late in the season, like AJ Brown. That's why I mentioned the Chase and Jefferson stuff. But even on the Chase and Jefferson stuff is a great example of what Blair's shown for years now, which is efficient rookies earn more volume in year 2. And those guys were guys that did start earning routes in week 1, basically. I think Jefferson maybe was ticked up just in week 2 right away, like didn't have maybe a full route share in week 1. I can't remember exactly. Chase was week 1 was running like 90% of the routes that year, his rookie year. And then those guys saw more volume after they were hits as a rookie, right? So like we see that. Anyway, it's like putting those two things together is an interesting way to think about the way that rookies. But you also said this. Travis Hunter ran a ton of routes last year. 502 routes in 13 games, over 38 routes per game, significantly more than Tet McMillan. It's about the same per game. McMillan played one last game, but he was at 459 routes. It's more per game than Tet McMillan. It's significantly more routes overall. If you want to just say, like, what did he handle over the course of a season, over the course of a fall? 502 routes. I was just mentioning there's not even that many NFL players every year that run 502 routes by PFF's numbers. He had ran 333 the year prior which was really his breakout season in terms of playing both ways. He was a true sophomore. This kid's still 21 years old. I mean, look, the stuff that he's been able to do, he can get better. He could get, he can grow into this even more potentially. I don't know. I think it's it's a little bit shocking to me that people have such a hard time understanding. Again, the 502 routes are significantly more, not just than McMillan, but a lot of other players in this class that only played wide receiver. He was also playing cornerback. He did this last year. It's not new to him. And, I was commenting on the Kyler Murray stuff and everything, but this is a guy who, if he's as dedicated as he seems to be, at the NFL level, there's no limits. They can send playbooks home with you. They can make things work. He might be the hardest working player in the NFL next year. We don't know. You know what I mean? He might be somebody who's willing to spend all of his mornings, evenings, and weekends, and obviously the weekends you're playing, but studying both playbooks and managing both positions as much as possible, which is, the NFL players get the day off on Monday and what have you. Would it really shock anybody if we learned that he's studying all day Monday as well? It wouldn't. It just wouldn't. Anyway. He's a fascinating player. This guy's such a big story. I know we just spent a ton of time on him, but I don't know. I've kind of hated the way that he's been covered clearly all winter and spring, because it's the greatest story in years, what this guy could potentially mean for the NFL, what he could do, what he's about to do, what I think he's about to do. And everyone's just what can't he do? Why can't he do it? What are the limitations? And that's all they want to talk about. I don't know.
I've gotten no impression like that. You haven't gotten riled up once when his name.
Have I not? Have I handled myself well about this? No. Let's move to the rest of the players, as you were alluding to, that aren't any good. No, I'm just kidding. There are some more intriguing profiles near the top. The next guy in expected draft capital right now is Matthew Golden, and a lot of people. He's apparently risen so much that he's right there with McMillan for some people. And yet everyone I talk to or read from the perspective of his numbers and his analytics and those types of things are saying that we got a lot of red flags here. You just told me you were digging into a group of more or less a top 27 wide receivers. This is before the show. 27-ish wide receivers, and kind of looking at some of the per route stuff so you could get some look at the numbers that I like to reference so we could kind of be on the same page. And in one of the numbers you looked at, he was 27th of 27. And even in a poor class, and this is the guy that's getting talked up as, other than Hunter, the number one wide receiver, potentially sliding in above Tet McMillan in draft capital. I look at the PFF numbers, 17.7% targets per out run last year. That's putrid. And there's not a yards per target to back it up. His yards per target was good last year. The after the target efficiency was good, but the overall yards per out run winds up being 2.10. People might be remembering me talking about Brian Thomas Jr.'s profile last year and how his targets per out run weren't exceptional. His targets per out run were much better at 19.3% than 17.7%. More importantly, his yards per target were a full yard and a half higher as well. So his yards per out run was more than a half yard higher, and he scored 17 touchdowns. Right? Part of the thing you kept talking to me about when we would talk about Brian Thomas is you don't get targeted the next play when you house it from 80 yards. He scored 17 touchdowns. Matthew Golden did not. Matthew Golden is a guy that played at Houston for 2 years and had 584 and 419 yards in 2 seasons against lesser competition. That's the other thing is okay, he had a tough year at Texas last year when he transferred up to a bigger program. And there's some talk that maybe the quarterback play was bad and this and that. But why was the production not there at Houston earlier if he's this talented of a player in his freshman or sophomore year? What is there anything in Matthew Golden's profile that suggests? We know that typically speaking, for high-end fantasy ceilings, we want to see production at the college level. Now, there's teams that may believe that he can play a role in their offense as a vertical threat or a certain specific type of player, but those guys tend to not be great fantasy players. They might be better real life than fantasy players. We talk about it sometimes. Is that what this is here?
Well, he was an explosive option for Texas last year, over 17 yards per reception. He has the 9 touchdowns. Again, when you think about how much total production they had, how many games they played, I mean, the numbers just look worse and worse. He's not really a guy who, on a per route basis, is drawing that many air yards. He's not someone who did much of anything after the catch in terms of evading tackles or generating yards after contact. Now, again, you're not always expecting that from a small, fast player, but you would love to have that ability to make a guy miss. He was able to catch the deep targets that he had. 17 of 18 of his catchable deep targets he caught. I mean, if you want to look at it from the perspective of a junior, like mini breakout and this amazing speed, then I think that makes some sense. But I mean, we work back around to the fact that his closest comp really by far is Henry Ruggs. And I mean, it seems like, in some ways I feel like this is just unnecessary hammering of both players. But I mean, Ruggs was drafted ahead of Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Jerry Jeudy, and Brandon Ayuk. You can't run your draft like that, right? And this class does not have those players to draft after him, but it does have players who are better than he is. And one of the notes that Scott Barrett had when we had him on OT that I thought was interesting and something I haven't given enough credit to when looking at his teammate, Isaiah Bond. I mean, Bond is someone who, again, not great production, but better production at Alabama than Golden had at Houston. And then, Bond was actually off to a very good start for this Texas team with 50 or more yards in each of the first 5 games. And then he gets hurt against Oklahoma. And that kind of opens the door for Golden to do, kind of what little he did. If you want to approach this from an arbitrage type of perspective, one of the things that's kind of interesting, and I'm not, wanting to make too strong of a point about this either way, but the gap in the 40 times for these two players is probably just completely and totally misleading. When you look at the top speed that they hit during the 40, Bond was faster. So if you're wanting to draft a speed, the other thing too was that the top speed was, much, much faster. And the 10-yard split was also fine. So you're kind of trying to figure out, how did he not time particularly well?
I've actually seen
the thing that, in the simulcast, that you're like, what's actually going on here?
Right. There's some stuff on Twitter. People are doing the sleuthing with the actual frames and saying that the time just doesn't seem like it was right. Like the combine got it wrong. So anyway, there's that whole part of it. You're talking about his production coming largely late in the year. To the extent that he had really any production, but because he didn't. He had ended up with 58 catches on the full season. But as you noted, they played 16 games. This is a team that played 3 playoff games in addition to a conference championship. In the first 10 of those games, he goes over 3 catches twice. And then he has a 7-catch game. He winds up having an 8-catch game in the conference championship, a 7-catch game in the quarterfinal against Arizona State. That's a double OT game. I don't know, how much of his production was happening in double OT, but the other games in there, his final conference game, 3 catches, the first round in the college football playoff, 2 catches, and the semifinal loss to Ohio State, 2 catches. Just so many games where he's not present, not earning volume or not making plays on that volume, whatever it may be. It's a little similar to Jalen Polk last year. We talked about, I didn't
As
watch
you were saying
guys.
it, that was the name that popped into my head of if you're that good, how do you go entire games without
making an impact?
Immediately you saw the Patriots are like, oh, lots of no production at the NFL level.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think that Golden is going to do that, right? I think he's going to be a viable reality piece. I think he could help a team. Is he going to help a team in a way that justifies where he's being ranked? Is he going to help your fantasy team? As you mentioned, those are different questions.
And the other thing I want to mention, you brought up Henry Ruggs, obviously the tragic situation for people who don't remember, I just want to add a little context. He did play a whole rookie season his first year, 13 games. He only had 43 targets, 26 receptions, pretty disappointing rookie season. And then he was 7 games into his second year when that incident occurred, 36 targets, 24 catches. He was up to 469 yards already in that second year. His yards per game had risen quite a bit, but still was not impressive, basically. 67 yards per game. It was okay in the early.
He was probably going to be a fine NFL role player, or slightly better than that. So it's not to say that like you got nothing out of Ruggs in a world where the tragedy didn't happen, but just the contrast with the other guys that you could have picked. And again, I don't think that contrast is as strong this year, but even as we're bashing the class, there are other interesting names.
Yeah. He played 20 NFL games, Ruggs. He caught more than 3 passes 3 times. He never caught more than 5 passes in a game. I'm not saying that would have defined his whole career, but we typically see superstars come out and act like superstars pretty early in their career. And so I don't think it's unfair of you to use that as a comp also, in terms of, we did see, I think, more playing time than people probably remember. Because even for me, I wanted to go back and look and remind myself, because you bring up that name and you feel like, you never really even got a chance to play. And anyway, by his own actions, obviously. So Golden is a tricky one, and he's one that it looks like is going to probably be overdrafted at the NFL level. It's never the case that we're saying that these players can't be good. We know that draft capital leads to opportunity, right? And so this guy's going to play at the NFL level when he gets drafted in the first round. They're going to run him on a lot of routes. They're going to throw him the ball probably. What we're talking about is relative to that draft capital and the volume expectations, the route expectations that come with that. He doesn't look like a great profile to be chasing, because it's probably not going to be particularly effective. And for me, when I look at the targets per out stuff and the per out data, and you make that Henry Ruggs comp, and I was talking about how little he did, it's a type of profile that can have some splash moments and maybe, but even like splash plays don't always work for splash weeks. If you're even thinking about like the best ball sense, I mean, a lot of times with guys like this, you will see a 2 for 49 in a TD game. And it's like, okay, but I mean, that's what, like 12 points or something, it's not that exciting with a long TD if you're only catching 2 balls. That's kind of my point with the Ruggs thing as well, as if you're running a lot of vertical routes and you're only getting a few opportunities on some vertical routes, and you aren't a dominant vertical route player because you didn't actually show that production in college, it's tough. It becomes pretty tough. Now, one thing in his favor, he was a good kick returner, a couple kick return touchdowns, a lot of kick return history for him. Maybe some potential for, I don't know, end around or ball in hand stuff there with his kick return profile. But somebody who doesn't look like he's going to live up in fantasy to the draft capital is probably the best way that we can put it. The next 2 guys that come up for most people, Sean, and for a while were expected to be first rounders. Now in the consensus big board stuff, they look like 1, 2, turn, like at that, I call it a turn, but it's the actual NFL draft. But the consensus big board I'm looking at here at NFL Mock Draft Database has Ibuka at 33, Luther Burden at 34. Two interesting players, 2 players who were really high prospects out of high school. This is something that I've talked about before. I love in your writing in the rookie guide, how you talk about their journey from the high school ranks. I've talked about this for years, obviously, with your work. Burden, you talked about, was the number 2 receiver in the 2022 cycle. Ibuka was the number 1 wide receiver, number 9 overall recruit in the 2021 cycle. 2 guys that have always been sort of destined for the NFL, but also have some concerns about what they did at college on the way to get there.
They do. I have a hard time with these guys being clumped that close together, because it does still, to me, feel like Luther Burden has much, much greater upside, better athlete, absolutely dynamic with the ball in his hands, which is one of the things that Ibuka isn't, despite being, that slot kind of guy where you really would like to have some of that dynamism. If you switch these 2 players where they went to school and you put Burden at Ohio State, would he be one of these guys who's a top 5 pick? I mean, we don't know, but it does seem possible. The thing that has kind of crushed him is a bad final season. You can't go into the NFL draft having been as unproductive as he was in your last year. Now, some of that, and it was interesting having Travis May on OT. Many listeners will know how good Travis is and how tied in he is to the college scene. He wasn't that worried about Burden and definitely wanted to put it on quarterback play and on the Missouri offense. And so I would offer this kind of what I think is an interesting contrast of in 2023, he's able to haul in 21 of 26 catchable deep balls, 0 drops, gains 617 of his yards that way, scores 5 touchdowns on those opportunities. You fast forward to 2024, and he only has 12 catchable deep balls. There's just no vertical component to the game at all. And what you're left with is this guy who is catching underneath passes and running with it. Now, I mean, Burden is very, very good at that. So there's almost this path for him where purely as a manufactured touch guy at the NFL level, I think he might be borderline viable. In addition to so one of the things I talked about how in 2023, he actually had pretty good deep production, but his ADOT is still super low because he had 67 targets within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. He does evade 23 tackles on those targets. So when you combine the different things he did in 2023, you're looking at a guy who is a potential top 6 or 7 pick. You fast forward again to the final season, and you again have a huge number of targets around the line of scrimmage. You have 32 evaded tackles, insane numbers, right? And then you mentioned some of the special teams with Golden. I mean, Burden is someone that Missouri has been desperate to get the ball to, even though they can't throw it down the field to him. He had 19 carries for 92 yards and 3 scores as a freshman. He had 125 yards and 2 scores on 10 carries as a junior. Almost all of those yards came after contact. I mean, these are the types of things where you're looking at Burden and saying, if we can get the ball in his hands, he's going to be a force. But we just don't have much track record of him being able to do the types of things that NFL receivers have to do, where they run real routes, they draw real targets, and flourish from a total production perspective. We know that players who have been manufactured touch guys over the last 5 to 10 years have been very risky. Not that they're going to all miss, but that's the thing I think that is raising so many red flags, so many eyebrows, so much concern in the NFL community. Because when you're talking about getting an athlete, and again, an on-field athlete, then, I mean, Burden is definitely someone who is going to be at the top of your list.
I was reading through your notes on him, looking at his targets per route stuff. It's really tricky because there's a lot of people have pointed out, as you just talked about, all the sort of scheme touches and all that stuff, but it's also the targets per route numbers are incredibly high, which they should be if he's getting a lot of scheme touches, but they are high. The ADOT is low because it's brought down by a lot of these touches around the line of scrimmage. That second season's really good, and you mentioned the deep stuff, and I thought that was really compelling that he didn't even get much deep volume in his third season. A lot in his lack of a downfield profile hinges on the fact that they weren't even necessarily able to get it to him. And I mean, he went to Missouri because he's from Missouri, but he was this top prospect that sort of could have picked his team, wanted to stay home, but still had to play in the SEC on a team that wasn't very good. And you question what he was thinking a little bit, right? But you also, the name that I'm thinking of as I look at this profile is Wan'Dale Robinson, who had just massive targets per out numbers at Kentucky, and a lot of it was manufactured. The ADOT was even lower than Luther Burden's. I pulled him up as well here. It was quite a bit lower, frankly. His overall ADOT over his 3 years, 791 routes was 7.8. Burden, 984 routes, over 200 more, was up at 9.1, a full yard, 1.3 yards higher, which is a meaningful gap when we're talking about the total air yards and the way that it's all going to kind of come together. But Wan'Dale Robinson's overall targets per out run were even higher. He's a guy who was just like his targets per out run at Kentucky were through the roof, just absolutely massive. And he has been able to get open at the NFL level is an interesting thing. he actually had this like same exact profile last year in several
He
games.
drew a
Like,
ton of targets.
yeah, he was like 8 catches for 41 yards. It was this profile, like just drawing a massive amount of targets at like a 4.2 ADOT. Can Burden have a little bit of Wan'Dale Robinson to his game in a good way, but be more than that? I mean, is that as offensive as a comp as it probably sounds to some people?
I just think the dynamism in terms of being able to break free from NFL defenders is going to be very different. I mean, you're talking about
He's
a
a
guy
bigger
who's 6
guy.
foot
He's
206.
200 pounds. Yeah.
And I mean, one of the things, on the flip side of that you get a little bit nervous about is just he's got tiny hands. Is he going to be someone who can make some of these downfield catches? You talk about how bad the Missouri passing offense was last year, and it's a big part of it. And yet it's still obviously a huge concern that his teammate, Theo Weiss, who is not really an NFL prospect, but again, more of a practice squad kind of guy, dramatically outperformed him in some of the important types of areas. And so we can make excuses for Burden. I think those excuses are justified, and yet it does lower the floor dramatically that he had such a bad final season. And so I've recently moved him down in my rankings kind of across the board from the perspective of he's probably not going to go as early as I was hoping. And you just have to reflect some of that risk.
Yeah. That final year concerns me. It's not just the lack of efficiency. The targets per out dropped a full 5 percentage points. I mean, it was way up there, 32.7%, dropped down to 27.7%. But like I said, with Wan'Dale, with a guy like that, where they were doing everything to get him the ball at the college level, I mean, his third season was a 37% targets per out. And you go to like even his first year, he was at 32, he was at 27.6, then he was at 37. The overall career was a 33.2% targets per out. For Burden is 28.0%, which is still, for a career, a 28% targets per out isn't a massive number. But it's concerning to me that so much of that was that second year. The first year was still strong, but then the third year, that side of it fell off too. It wasn't just the efficiency. It's the fact that they weren't even like scheming touches for him the way that, again, Kentucky was making all this effort to get the ball to a guy like Wan'Dale.
Well, Wan'Dale was able to do some of these other elements, especially at the college level. I mean, one of the things that you and I talked about, we talked about a lot with Stephon Diggs through the years, was that some of the things that, are going to deflate maybe the ADOT or make a certain part of the profile not look quite as good as someone else, at least in one way of framing it, is actually a positive. All you're doing is adding more manufactured touches on top of that, which then is saying, okay, well, if you did all the normal things and then you had a bunch of production under 5 yards, and it probably isn't appropriate to bring Bo Nix into this, but one of my points with him was that so much of what people were talking about last year was simply that he did all of the normal things that you would want, and then they also flourished on the incredibly short plays, and then that makes the overall profile look weird, right? So you want to see if both things are there. With Burden, both things were there in 2023. They were not there in 2024. And if you're going to be a first-round pick and the focal point of your offense, which I just think you need to be if you're a first-round pick, not having that in your final season, again, it's hugely problematic.
It's super alarming. To add a little numerical context to the Wan'Dale point, I mean, his first year, he was at a 3.38 out, very, very low. Then he went up to 6.2. Then he went up to 10.4 the final year. When that targets per out run really spiked, I have the weighted targets per out number here. He was up to 0.94 that year. Burden in his second season, the good one, was his weighted targets per out run was 0.78. That dropped to 0.67 his final year. So Wan'Dale developed his 10.4 ADOT that I mentioned, his final year, was better than any year of Burden's career. His total air yards that year, because he had all the targets at that higher ADOT. You mentioned he did some of these things at the college level. 1,456 air yards over on by PFS numbers. Burden's career high is 1,044, just over 1,000 relative to almost 1,500. So, and Wan'Dale was kind of growing that way. As you were talking through that, I was remembering that's what I liked so much about the Wan'Dale profile was how it built. And the ADOT rose over his 3 years, and he was doing more down the field. For Burden to come back and 737 air yards last year, I mean, certainly a concern that we didn't see. You mentioned only the 12 deep targets overall, but I mean, it's just a little bit
12
odd.
catchable. So
it makes me want to go back and watch. I mean, I haven't seen all the Missouri games, but like watch all the games and be like, did I just hate their coaching staff? Somebody's listening to this as a Missouri fan. I want you to tell me if like their offensive scheme was just horrible because,
and you watch the plays from 2023 and you don't get the sense that 2024 is coming, which again, when you're a big time prospect and you have a good 2023 and the guy looks good everywhere, you're not thinking that we're going to fall off the cliff. You had mentioned Ibuka as the other name in that same group. He's, I want to say the opposite, but his main thing is just there's no dynamism.
There's no dynamism. I want you to expand on that. I do want to note that I like the targets per out run stuff. His second season was his second highest in routes, his sophomore year, 2022. And he was banged up a little bit through 2023. His routes were quite a bit lower, 256. Then they were back up in 2024. In that second season in 2022, he was competing with Marvin Harrison. In this past season in 2024, he was competing with Jeremiah Smith, who was a freshman at Ohio State and is going to be like the next Julio Jones. Was just fantastic. For anyone who didn't watch a lot of college football, I mean, Smith was good even into the biggest stages as they went on to win the national title. He's a player. That dude's a big boy who can play. When I say the next Julio Jones, meaning big and fast like that, right? He was fun to watch. So Ibuka was behind basically probably 2 top 10 picks at the NFL level in his 2 biggest seasons, and yet earned pretty solid targets per route numbers, 27.5%, 26.4% in those 2 years. The ADOTs are lower. It's mostly a slot guy, right? I think you're going to tell us about that. But the yards per route run stuff was, I mean, it's not bad. It's not great or anything, but at the ADOT, like it's pretty okay. I like that he earned a lot of targets per route. I've always liked those types of players. If you can't do anything down the field, that's a problem. But especially in PPR leagues, right? This type of profile can be fantasy relevant, maybe not elite, but it can be pretty fantasy relevant. And in a perfect situation, it could be a poor man's Amon-Ra St. Brown. Probably not. He's probably not that dynamic. And again, I think you're going to tell us that when you start to get into the evasion numbers and some of those things. But, can he be a poor man's Chris Olave, who had a similar profile where he didn't have as much targets per route run dominance when he was playing alongside Garrett Wilson and JSN and those guys at Ohio State, but has been able to dominate volume at the NFL level. And yet Olave, again, slightly different player because he's able to do it down the field in a way that I get the impression Ibuka's not.
Well, you mentioned Olave. His usage in Ohio State bounced around some because he was playing with Wilson and JSN, and he did have a mildly disappointing final season, but the vertical element was there, and we've continued to get that at the NFL level. And the idea that he was very polished also seemed to be true, even though the numbers that he put up when he was playing with both Wilson and JSN were more mediocre. I think, when you look at Ibuka and you think about how overshadowed he was by Marvin Harrison, is that as big a deal now? When you mentioned the top 10 picks, I mean, Smith could be the future number 1 overall pick. And so having the numbers knocked down a bit this last year, I mean, that kind of makes sense. But again, the total numbers in a 16-game season, just, they almost don't even scream day 2, right? And then when you dig into what he's done, he becomes the slot guy after JSN, 65 and 82 targets out of the slot in 2022 and 2024. He does go for 541 and 479 yards after the catch, but the evasion numbers not there. And you watch him play, he does get open, and that does matter. I think he could be a solid possession receiver at the NFL level, more a wide receiver 2, maybe a better fit as a wide receiver 3 on a team, which that does matter. That role is important. But I mean, there's still lots of people out there who are skeptical of JSN. I think with The moves that Seattle has made in the offseason, I'm now actually pretty concerned about JSN myself going forward. But I do want to emphasize, I just don't think these guys are remotely similar prospects, right? So when we're thinking about slot dynamism, what does that mean? Doesn't matter. JSN, 816 yards after the catch in that 2021 season and 26 evaded tackles. Ibuka, 26 evaded tackles for the 3 years combined. And then we kind of go to this idea of, are you really generating yardage for your team? Now, one of the things that we can look at with Ohio State and say, not only did they have Jeremiah Smith, but they also have these running backs. They are going to want to use them. One of the things when you look at the running backs and the receiving numbers for them, you're thinking, well, Henderson and Judkins would probably have better receiving numbers if they weren't in an offense that had Smith and Ibuka. So it can kind of work both ways with these players. But, I mean, Ibuka been one 100-yard game in his last 26 appearances, and that game was against Marshall. I just don't think that works, right? It's not enough. And again, to create a little bit of context and why I was maybe overly enthusiastic about JSN and still in some ways might be, he finished his 2021 season with 8 consecutive games of 97 or more yards, including games of 200 and 300. Now that's playing with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. Now in the 300-yard game, they did sit out, right? And in that game, Marvin Harrison went off as the number 2. So again, this was a very, very loaded team, and that Marvin Harrison is just sitting behind those guys when all 3 of them are going off. You just don't have that with Ibuka, and some of it probably is just this kind of remnant of the fact that he was the number 1 overall recruit and was certainly good enough to be on the field and play. But when you have that kind of recruiting profile, when you're good enough, I mean, is all of that going to carry over to the NFL level? Do we have the dynamism here to use a first-round pick on this player?
I think
maybe.
that's an interesting...
I mean, some of these guys who are overshadowed by true superstars, they get to the NFL level and their teammates are actually worse than them instead of better, and suddenly you're like, oh, well, I mean, this guy can do it.
Yeah. That's like the Chris Olave story, right? I think it's an interesting point that because he was such a massive prospect, he was basically always going to play and get his opportunity at Ohio State. And so there's almost like a floor that you would expect, and you'd like to see what the situational stuff more than what we saw, right? It's similar to, your research years ago to the like career arcs of different wide receivers and sort of breakout seasons. You showed that first round picks and early round picks break out earlier in their career. And if you are going to get like a year 3 or a year 4 breakout, it tends to actually be these late round picks who don't get the early opportunity in their career because they're not just handed that. And so the point is, the parallel I'm trying to draw is even at the NFL level, we see a similar dynamic where it's the profile coming in, the draft capital coming in, sort of similar to him being the number 1 overall receiver coming into Ohio State, is going to afford you a certain floor of opportunity, maybe not necessarily production, but especially at the college level, probably production. He's probably going to be good enough to produce to some degree against weaker opponents across the board than you'll ever have at the NFL level. But that we should see something beyond that. And he played 4 years of college ball. We should probably see a significant, bar being raised when you start at, with that type of a caliber or that type of a profile. I mean, I think it's an interesting point. I don't know. I'm just kind of chewing on it and thinking about it.
Dip down into the high 90s there for JSN just to kind of emphasize how consistent he was. It is worth noting that there are 5 additional games in that 26-game stretch where Ibuka goes over 90. But then again, one of the sort of weird things about it for someone who is projected to the edge of the first round is that 2 of those games were against Youngstown State and Western Michigan. So again, the opportunities he's actually getting to be the focal point or to get that volume, they tend to be when the opponent is just completely overmatched.
Very fascinating. You mentioned being a little concerned about JSN. I hopped on chip chasing last week and mentioned to those guys, I guess 2 weeks ago now, mentioned to those guys, they were asking a little bit about my thoughts on the Seahawks, that I was pretty concerned about it. Pat said something to the effect of, if you're concerned about it, we should be concerned about it. Now I hear that you're concerned about it, and you're the other guy that I know that is incredibly high on Jason. It's not a good situation in Seattle. And I think when you really chew with it and sit with it and chew on it, you realize it's not going to work favorably for JSN specifically and how he wins. I think all of that is pretty problematic. But yeah, hearing you throw that note in there, I just wanted to mention to the listeners that I'm having very similar concerns about him. And he's expensive in the early drafts, very expensive. A lot. I mean, he had a good year last year, but a lot of buy-in there from the market in a way that, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be drafting.
He may be a guy who is similar to, I mean, I always talk about the 49ers as a team that I feel like is easy to play because they're a little bit more efficiency based bets than volume bets. And so anytime they're down, when people are more focused on the volume, you buy. Anytime they're up, when people are more focused on the efficiency, you just kind of let those guys go to other people. It's a different dynamic with JSN, but he seems like someone where, because of the controversy about him coming in, which I didn't think there should have been, but then the slow start and then what we saw last year, would it surprise you if he like bounces back between not really overvalued, but valued where there's not as much to squeeze out, and then like wildly undervalued again, and then people may be overly enthusiastic as we, traverse like this next decade with him?
Yeah, no, that I think is almost feels likely at this point, right? Like we can just pencil them into our 2026 drafts, but we'll maybe have to set out a little bit more in 2025. So that's sort of the top group as far as what I'm seeing in expected sort of draft capital and the mock big boards. You get later in the second round, you have Jaden Higgins coming in, you have Trey Harris coming in. Trey Harris is a guy you mentioned to me pre-show. Once I really dig into him, I'm probably going to like quite a bit. He has a very intriguing profile. But then my point was going to be that as you start to get into these, you look at these mock draft databases, you look at the consensus big boards, etc. There is a huge pack of wide receivers that starts to come out. So this is I'm looking right now at mock draft database at their consensus big board. They have Higgins ranked 49th. They have Trey Harris at 62nd. Behind Harris, there are other receivers at 63, 66, 67. So 4 in 6 picks there. Then 84, 86, 90, 105, 108. Over the next round or so of picks, 35-ish picks, you have, I think I just listed 9 different wide receivers come out. And then there's several more just after that. In the 120s, there's a couple more. There ends up being a little bit of a gap. And then as far as what looks like day 3 type-ish grades in the low 200s, maybe those are almost UDFA grades, but there's a ton of names there as well, which is probably always somewhat the case with wide receiver. But my point being, what I'm getting from the market, from draft analysts, from these expected draft position elements. Oh, I missed Isaiah Bond in there as well. It's 77 because there's an ad here pushing him out of the way. But there's another name that I missed in that ranking area. What I'm getting is these different clumps where they're saying, here's a whole bunch of dudes that we think might be day 2 guys. Here's a whole bunch of dudes we think might be day 3 guys. We don't really know how to organize them or how the NFL is going to view it or who's going to get drafted ahead of who. And the profiles, we talked about this at the top, Sean, a lot of them are not that exciting. They're just sort of blah to some degree. Anyway,
I would say, though, that I think there's a group here that objectively is almost certainly better than Golden and Ibuka. And if we got that group to go, so I should name the group so people can kind of follow where I'm thinking here. So we have Trey Harris, Io Manor, Royals, and Higgins, all as players who are interesting in one way or another that I think does make them a compelling NFL starter, and probably the perfect thing for fantasy managers, if you like them, would be that they go late enough to not dramatically move their ADPs and early enough that you can feel comfortable that the team feels the same way that you do. And so somewhere between, say, 45 and 60 would be perfect to kind of hit that window where they're probably not going to move dramatically, but you can feel comfortable that the team has an evaluation that's going to push them out there onto the field right away.
I think that's a great note. You mentioned Harris as a big part of that group. Let's talk about him for a second. He was a 5-year guy, but already in his second year was earning targets at a pretty good clip at a high ADOT, 13.5 ADOT, 23% targets per out, like pretty solid weighted targets per out of 0.64. And that just went up every year after that. It went up to 0.67, 0.77. Last year, he earned 37.8 or a target on 37.8% of his routes, which is a massive number. It's bigger than that number I was given a little bit ago on Wan'Dale Robinson. And it was at a much higher ADOT as well, 12.0. So 1.01 weighted targets per out. You don't see a lot getting up over 1. Now, that was his 5th year. Now, his first year, he basically didn't play because it was 2020. It was the, pandemic season. He's a true freshman. He runs 9 routes. They play a couple of games, whatever. In the 4 years since, he's never really ran a ton of routes. And even this 2024 season, only 201 routes. It's actually his next lowest year in terms of volume. Was he banged up last year?
Yeah, he gets injured. And so a little bit of the concern with him, similar to what we just mentioned with Ibuka, is that he put up huge numbers against Furman, Middle Tennessee State, and Georgia Southern. But except for the game there where his season ends against Florida, he puts up good numbers against everybody else too.
So he looked like he was on his way to a huge final season. His yards per route run that final year, 5.12. I mean, that's just absurd. He only runs 201 routes again, and you just mentioned the competition was pretty weak for most of that. But even the year prior, he was at 3.17, still a fantastic yards per route run. He's over 2 in the 2 seasons prior to that as well. He was at, looking at your right up here, he was at Louisiana Tech originally. Then he transfers to Ole Miss, which is probably explains part of the 5-year thing. One of the things, I remember with Xavier Legette last year was talking about how, he had a kind of a weird journey, but he had a productive 5th season. And one of the reasons I was somewhat interested in him was, even though it took until his 5th season, even though we know we want that production to be earlier and those types of things, getting to see really dominant production is, at least to me, better than not, in the sense that we know production begets production, in part because we need to see the player's ability to utilize their skills to actually turn that into yards and touchdowns. Like, there's way too much of like, let me just look at his 40 time and this kind of stuff. Oh, he's fast. He's going to be an NFL player. Wide receiver is a more intricate position than that. You have to be able to run routes. You have to be able to have ball skills and understand leverage and so many things. So I liked, I'm mentioning Legette because, he was a 5-year player who had this big final season and basically didn't do anything prior to that. I liked that we saw in that final season, big numbers. For Harris, he has over 1,000 yards, his career high in his 5th year on only a 200 routes. Again, 5+ yards per route, but was also good before that. He's not like Legette. There's other production in years 2, 3, and 4, but I'm not just writing off 2024 because it was a 5th year small route sample. This is really dominant. Again, you mentioned the weak competition, but it's really dominant stuff in a way that, again, if you're going to get targeted on 38% of your routes and you're going to generate 5+ yards per route over 200, 200 is not none routes. I'm at least like, how to translate your ability, your skills, and your ability to yards. And he shows that to a lesser degree in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th years of this profile as well. Overall, looks like a pretty strong talent, a guy who can earn targets at a high ADOT and then can convert efficiency after the target as well.
Yeah, I think having those 3 strong seasons in a row, including at 2 different schools, is encouraging. You have some very good peripherals in 2023, that first year, at Ole Miss, where he has 232 yards after contact. You have the breakout season with a 35% dominator the previous year for Louisiana Tech. He's similar in many ways, I think, to Burden, where we just really don't know. The Ole Miss offense is controversial. They do a lot of things that don't necessarily apply to the NFL. I thought it was interesting having, again, both Travis and Scott on. Scott was concerned about basically this being fake production. And I do note in his write-up that the only receiver with a higher rating, so the rating when the QB throws to you in 2024, was his teammate Jordan Watkins, who after Harris is injured goes on to put up very impressive numbers himself. Travis's point was that even though this offense may not be an NFL style of offense, it's also not necessarily that similar to Tennessee, where we see guys inflated in a way that makes them look really good and then they're not actually great prospects. I guess I'm fairly enthusiastic about Jackson Dart. And so it's kind of one of these questions of, if you really like him, does it actually hurt the receiver because a lot of it is on the QB, or, there's obviously a symbiotic relationship, at least to an extent here, where they're helping each other. I just really would have liked to have seen what Harris was able to do down the stretch. Was he able to keep up anything like this pace? Because the pace was pretty extraordinary. One of the things, in these 8 games, he's over 1,000 yards. I think it's probably at least mildly reasonable to be concerned about Jonathan Mingo getting overdrafted out of this offense just 2 years ago. But I mean, he was overdrafted on athleticism, right? Where you look at his season, 13 games, 860 yards and 5 touchdowns. There was no justification for him to go where he went anyway. It's kind of a separate question to whether or not Harris should be considered a second-round pick here. One of the things that I like with Harris is that you have size, but you also have some decent movement. You've got some vertical ability. Even if some of it is manufactured, if you can both get down the field and you can make some guys miss, you can do some things with the ball in your hands as, a medium-sized to big receiver. I think, again, having multiple paths to production at the NFL level is very, very helpful. And I think it gives him at least a little bit of a floor.
Mingo ran at least 200 routes in 4 college seasons. Trey Harris did as well. Not all of them at Ole Miss, as you noted. But as you write about in the rookie guide, he turned his production up when he went to Ole Miss, when he got to the tougher division. He's older at that point. Harris's targets per out run, weighted targets per out run, and yards per out run in all 4 of his seasons, all of those stats were better than Jonathan Mingo's best season. So definitely different production, as you were just discussing. Mingo got overdrafted more on athleticism. He didn't have anything like the profile of Trey Harris. He didn't have anything until his final year, and his final year still wasn't even as good as what Trey Harris was doing, as a sophomore way back when. So Harris looks exciting, although, as you note, those caveats, I guess I start to be a little bit concerned about the ceiling. The stuff you mentioned, I know Scott's done work for years on whatever you use the word, fake production or fraudulent. There's certain types of production that can inflate certain profiles. Like I know the deep slot production is a big thing that he has talked about a lot. When I start hearing that stuff, I do get a little bit concerned. That was one of those things I know was an issue for like a N'Keal Harry on his profile and some of those types of guys. So it's not a guarantee that Trey Harris can't produce. And what Trey Harris's profile is from a pure production standpoint is at least interesting enough to think that he's going to be good, but maybe there's not quite a massive ceiling. Maybe he's a long-term productive NFL receiver, but not huge fantasy asset necessarily, right? And so I don't want to get too excited just because he's the only other prospect that looks like he's, any fun, at least super fun from these per route numbers that I love to look at. But you mentioned 3 other dudes there. Is it Alec? Aomenor? Jalen Royals, Jaden Higgins. You mentioned Isaiah Bond being basically better than Matthew Golden earlier, but you don't see Bond as being with those other 3 guys?
I don't, but It's an interesting season in part because we have so many older players, and Ben, so much of the research that we've done and that have benefited from so much is based on things like breakout age. When did the production happen? How early do you get to the NFL? I mean, Blair writes every year about these 21-year-old rookies and how they just crush everything. Well, we are still kind of in the midst of two sea changes in prospect evaluation or just how college football is being played, because we're still dealing with some of the hopefully final consequences of the pandemic and how that got people off to a slow start in their college careers, and then the NIL transfer era where it may just simply make more sense for so many guys to stay as opposed to go. So you're looking at different types of players and different ages as people are coming into the NFL. You take that one more step and look at someone like a Jalen Royals, and this is a player, again, I just don't really know what to do with him, but it's interesting because he's not that small of a guy. He feels like a small player when you think about, okay, he originally goes to Georgia Military Academy, he transfers to Utah State over the last, so I mean, obviously not playing against elite competition there. Over the last 20 games.
Georgia Military Academy? I've never even. Who knew?
It's a military academy.
They have a football team?
Posted limited stats is my
okay.
Is my note there. Okay. For the last 20 games, right? 1,914 yards, 21 touchdowns, 39% dominator. And the per route numbers don't look that great. And I think especially if you're talking about a small school guy, then that is disconcerting. But it's really not the way probably to look at it. I note that when he put the Aggies on his back, he says 12.7 ADOT, 137 receiver rating, 95% on target catch rate, 229 yards after contact, 12 broken tackles. Like Harris, the problem that we have for him, or one of the problems that we have for him, is he only plays 7 games in his last year, and the numbers are encouraging. 119 yards per game, that's second in college football, but you're dealing with a small sample and you're dealing with a small school, all of those types of things. And then there are also some concerns, I think, about the overall athleticism there. But one of the things that shows up in his Senior Bowl tracking numbers, that shows up in his 10-yard split, and that shows up even in the tracking of other drills at the combine, is that Jalen Royals almost certainly has the best first step in this class. And this is a class that's loaded with elite athletes who don't really have production. You look at Royals and you're saying, okay, maybe not the crazy top speed from 15 yards to 40 or 50 or 60, whatever. In that short area, no one can stay with him. I think he's an interesting NFL prospect as a result of that, in that we know being able to get open right off the line of scrimmage is a trait that is always important and perhaps increasingly so.
Yeah, he's interesting. You noted at the end of your write-up, 119 receiving yards per game, was second in college football last year. Talk about Ao Menor. So you wrote he redshirted, and then he sort of blew up as a redshirt freshman. He's young. He played 2 years and earned volume, over 24% targets per route both years at a 14 plus ADOT. I mean, weighted targets per route of 0.69 to 0.71 are very good numbers for a true freshman, true sophomore. He's a 3-year early declare, had over 1,500 air yards both years. The yards per target really craters last year, so his yards per route looks a lot less impressive in 2024. That after the target efficiency is not there, but looks like a guy for a high ADOT guy that can earn targets and earn volume. Was there some kind of context of the quarterback position at Stanford or something that we should be aware of?
Well, I think Stanford has, yes, not had the type of QB play and the type of offense that would really lend themselves to having a breakout prospect, which is one of the reasons I think that his 2023 season especially is so impressive. When you think about within the context of the offense, I mean, this is a 45% dominator guy. And when you're talking about basically coming off of 2 years of redshirting, but I mean, those are huge numbers in your first season out there on the college football field. When you talk about instant breakout, that for me is exciting. And then you think about a guy who's 6'2", 206 pounds, 84th percentile explosion. That's athleticism that goes with it. And so when we're thinking about sort of the overall profile here, and even with the fall back in 2024, still good numbers. Now, his drop rate on deep targets was extremely high last year, and you need to catch those passes because that's the opportunity to really pad your stats with big plays, get those yardage numbers, all of those types of things. But the overall prospect profile here, and especially giving us somebody who has a better experience adjusted trajectory. I mean, one of the things I note too, you have that really, really good 2023 season, and there are 116 additional DPI yards on that also. So this to me, especially when you think about the physical profile, this is an NFL receiver. Now, if it's an NFL 1 versus 2, or if it's a guy who's asked to do things that free up his teammates, and so again, you're getting more of a fantasy wide receiver 3 as opposed to a true top end guy. I mean, again, that's probably the case. That seems to be how the NFL is viewing him. But Isle Manor, when you think about, again, what he was able to accomplish with targets, air yards, all of those types of things, and the efficiency of that 2023 season, I've moved him up recently, as I think that there's a chance that he gets drafted earlier than expected. And then one of the things that we have always kind of seen from these guys who have the elite experience adjusted trajectories in college is that they're often, certainly not exclusively, but often the guys who make an immediate impact at the NFL level. So this could be kind of a sneaky situation where you don't have to pay a lot, but you actually get 2025 numbers.
I love it. It seems a little bit like another Stanford guy, Michael Wilson, to me. You were talking about like a player that might be, I mean, maybe that's underselling him, what he can do, but might be, an NFL receiver, but might be doing a little bit more to free up other players. But Wilson, I think, has been reasonably productive the last couple of years, and has been a guy that has mattered in the fantasy, in the best ball landscape a little bit. You're wondering if he has the ceiling to be more impactful, like in season-long leagues, which we will find out. All these names are running together, Sean. I'm getting tired. Jaden Higgins. What do you got for us on Jaden Higgins?
So I want to make the case that Higgins, if we kind of exempt Travis Hunter as this wild card superstar, et cetera, make the case that Higgins is actually the wide receiver 2 in this class. And try not to push his ADP up, try not to overdraft him yourself. But this is a fun guy in that we have that sort of wide receiver 1 NFL size and athleticism, right? You're getting 91st percentile freak score. You're getting 87th percentile explosion. You've got a guy who is playing opposite Jalen Noel. And I mean, Noel's kind of a weird prospect where his athleticism was also off the charts at the combine. And I think that part is pretty exciting. Noel's one of these guys who's really fun to watch because, you see his highlights and you're like, yeah, you can see the athleticism there. And yet Higgins was very clearly the better player in 2024. He has that 38% dominator in his final season while splitting time with him. And not only does he have this sort of well-rounded portfolio, right? So you think about well-rounded, 56 of his 136 targets come out of the slot. He's got the 11.6 ADOT. He really thrived at every depth in terms of kind of going with 5, 10 to 15, and then 15 plus as your buckets. 44 underneath targets, 56 intermediate targets, 36 deep targets. He had the 4th most DPI yards in the country on top of that. But one of the things that I think is kind of fun is that he has this ultra electric slot receiver playing with him. And yet on the underneath routes, he had a higher catch rate and much better evasion numbers than Noel. Bunch of forced missed tackles, evaded tackles. Then this is, again, kind of this portfolio, or I should say profile, that I really like to see, where you've got someone who checks all of these boxes. He's got that size athleticism box, but then you can play him inside, you can play him out, you can target him in all depths. And when he has the ball in his hands, he's also dynamic. Now, again, whether that really stretches to overall wide receiver 1 types of upside in the future, I mean, maybe not. And yet, I mean, this is a player you can dream on and still get at very reasonable prices.
Well, there you go. There is an interesting name. Yeah, I mean, the profile's intriguing. The stuff that I'm looking at is intriguing. Eastern Kentucky. We were talking about him before the show a little bit. I thought Eastern Kentucky had to have... I couldn't find his numbers from Eastern Kentucky, and then I realized I was thinking of Western Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky even smaller than Western Kentucky's, an FBS. They got the Hilltoppers out there. I don't know anything about Eastern Kentucky. And he wasn't necessarily great at Eastern Kentucky, but the 2 really strong seasons at Iowa State from a per route perspective.
But I don't know exactly what numbers PFF has, but when I'm looking at the SIS here, I mean, he's right there in that same kind of bucket in terms of targets per route with McMillan, with Royals, with someone like a Tez Johnson, who was an interesting player kind of in a different context.
Yeah. No, his numbers are great. The final season, 29%, 0.78 weighted targets per route, because there's a solid ADOT with that. 24.4% in the first year with Ohio State, but the yards per target were actually much higher that first year. So the yards per route run better. As you were talking through a little bit, what is there any other names that you just mentioned? Tez Johnson, he kind of popped a little bit in the stuff I was looking at, but isn't he like 150 pounds? What's the deal with him?
Is he very little?
He's very, very small, right? So I'm just gonna ignore that. Tutu Atwell had a really good profile as well, but we've seen that to be a little bit of a problem. I'm not going to completely ignore him.
The big off-season news, which is the Rams have decided that Tutu is going to be a key part of their offense. The draft Tez Johnson for 2030.
Maybe Tez Johnson is that new dude. I mean, is he somebody you want to talk a little bit about? Are there any other guys that we haven't mentioned yet that really intrigue you a little further down?
Well, if we're going to talk about, I guess, this class, if we bring in a one-year wonder there, I really like Ty Felton. Plays 4 years for Maryland. He works his way up. He finally gets that big jump to a 38% dominator in 2024. 1,674 air yards, 315 yards after contact, 28 evaded tackles. And he's got this interesting mix, right, where he has the 71 targets within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. And you're thinking, well, that seems very manufactured. But with that, 22 evaded tackles and 224 yards after contact, draws 40 intermediate targets and scores 4 times. He draws 30 deep targets for over 1,000 air yards. Again, this is the kind of balance that would give you multiple ways to win. I do think that one of the issues potentially for him, and you think about the one-year wonder nature of it, is that on those deep targets, 18 of them are catchable. He only actually pulls in 9 and 3 of them are pure drops, that's going to hurt your ability to have those splash plays that truly separate you out. Because, honestly, if you can get over the top and teams are willing to manufacture some production from you, even though we know these intermediate targets, both in terms of intermediate depth and over the middle of the field, tend to be things that really open up an NFL offense. Not everybody has that, right? And if you can do a little bit, what we saw with Xavier Worthy this last year, that is kind of a profile that I would say is somewhat similar. The other reason you get really excited about him is that you have a 4.37 40, you have 91st percentile explosion. The Workout Explorer claims that he's like a little bit bigger version of Emmanuel Sanders or a more explosive version of Garrett Wilson. Those notes would be obviously pretty exciting. We have a lot of very, very fast players in this draft, but most of them have basically zero production. Felton is your path to getting one of these guys who is electric and actually did something on the football field.
Interesting. Yeah, really slow first few years, though. But as you mentioned, that final year shows that he can do something on the football field, as you said, produce a little bit, earns a lot more volume. The yards per target, not quite as great, kind of waned while his volume earning jumped, which is a little bit of a concern for me. But
like I said, he dropped a lot of deep targets that would help him.
If he caught some of those, that would have been helpful. Yeah, this class, it does feel a little bit like, how surprising would it be to you? I guess it's in a probabilistic sense, it's very unlikely because there's enough names. But how surprising would it be to you if we look back and there's only like 3 NFL players in this class? It seems to me like that's what's going to wind up happening. Someone's got to hit from somewhere with a kind of not very good profile. But I just look at this and I'm like, this is not going to be the class that redefines the wide receiver position at the NFL level.
It doesn't seem like it, unless Luther Burden, hits on a 90th percentile outcome. If we immediately get and just continue to get, more or less, not full, but 90% routes, 90% of what, you would expect, not much 90%, but from Travis Hunter. If you get those 2 guys in it, then you only have to add a couple of sleepers. I do think that Jalen Knoll is interesting. I think that Keandre Lambert-Smith is interesting. Again, if you want to get some athleticism there, if you want to get some production, Ricky White is interesting. He had a terrible combine. Somebody who, again, kind of gets lost because of final year injury. Torrey Horton actually had an interesting combine, and in 2022 and 2023 was a very productive player. So I think that we have some outs. We have some interesting guys we can use our, lottery ticket draft slots on. I think it will be fun to make those picks and then see who starts to get all the buzz in training camp. There's enough depth with how athletic so many of these guys are that we could find some guys lower. And then the depth part is rounded out by some names that are not sexy because the guys are not very athletic and didn't play at big schools, but actually do have closer to what you would consider an NFL production profile. I think that once we take all of these profiles that are missing a big element and consider how many names there are in the mix, and that if you do have freak athleticism or you do have very impressive production, then we've talked, for almost a decade now, how if someone who is drafted late does break out, they do tend to have an outstanding trait, whether that's athletically or production-wise. Usually they don't have everything, which is why they lasted to the point in the draft that they did. I think that there are fun names in those categories this year, but certainly the idea that we would be able to simply go and draft whoever's there and that the first rounders are going to hit, the second rounders are going to hit. That's, I think, one of the things that you're really sort of expressing here is that we don't have a lot of names in the first and second round, and even the names that we do have are risky.
Yeah. And I think you said that well. I mean, that's what I kind of said probabilistically. There's enough profiles that aren't disqualifying profiles, right? That you'd expect somebody from that group to do something at some point, but it's a tough group to wade through. It'll be, most years I'm more concerned about our pre-draft evaluation at wide receiver than the way that the NFL looks at it or where the landing spots are, those types of things. This year, maybe going to be a little bit more open to draft capital being a signal and situation being. And I mean, we always have to be somewhat open to that. When you start to hear some of the August buzz, some of those things can happen. Like go back to Tank Dell's rookie year in Houston. They're talking about how much CJ Stroud liked him, all off season, or obviously Puka Nakua's, and with the Rams, the buzz there was definitely about him. As far as later round guys or less heralded guys that we started to hear really positive things about, and the situations were reasonably gettable, right? I mean, it'll be that kind of thing could happen even before September, right? And we may be feeling differently about a few of these dudes, but right now it's interesting to dig into the names. It was a lot of fun talking to you about it and getting to ask your thoughts on a lot of these guys and hearing the ways that you're viewing them. I'm intrigued to hear how the NFL views them and to see where these guys are all going to fall on draft night, which is, 8 days away now.
Yeah, we're right on the precipice. Ben, can the listeners expect a college wide receiver target per route article from you in the next, in between now and the draft?
Well, I mean, they can expect it, but whether they're actually going to get it will be interesting. No, I wrote a long introduction, and rather than getting into the receivers, I just decided to start writing about the running back class to some degree. Not really specific names, but more just a little bit of theory about how I think it's going to fit into the NFL landscape. Some of the stuff that I like to talk about and think about and ponder. And I got to the end of that big introduction that I wrote yesterday morning, and I was like, I don't even want to write about the wide receivers. But now that I've talked to you a little bit, I mean, I set up the receiver stuff too, and I have all the names in there. And I mentioned to you, I've taken a bunch of notes, but I mean, it's just a lot of, I guess this could be a thing. But anyway, we had fun talking about it today. The Substack readers will get something from me. It may just wind up being the running back introduction that I just referenced.
Yeah, well, I think anybody who's listened to you explain that is probably mostly fired up to get whatever you want to write about. We know that's always a real treat. We've got lots up for you on RotoViz. Blair doing excellent work. Kevin doing excellent work. Lots of other guys chiming in. We're having a lot of fun. Ben, I'm sure you and I will have some cool things going on for the NFL draft. Until then, this has been Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you are signed up. bengretch.substack.com to get Stealing Signals and the next great piece that comes out, as we just referenced. If you want the 10% discount to RotoViz on your one-year subscription, it is RV Radio 2025 at checkout. Then, once the draft is in the books, we will have volume 3 of the rookie guide. That includes a coupon for the one-year sub that wipes out the cost of the guide. If that is appealing to anyone, this has been fun. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.